Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. On this edition of the program, we discuss the West, particularly Washington's stated objective to isolate Russia on the back of the crisis in Ukraine. In London, we have Martin McCauley. He's a Russia specialist at the University of London. We also have James Thackara. He's a novelist and human rights activist. Here in Moscow with me is Andrew Korybko. He's a Moscow-based journalist and analyst. And we also have Charlie Bausman. He is the director and head of investor relations at AVG Capital Partners. Martin, if I can go to you first in London, we hear a lot of talk about isolating Russia over the last few months. What's been the impact? What's been the result?
I think the result is that you can't isolate Russia. Russia is a major power. It's looking to the east. It's looking to America. And it's a major player in the Middle East. You have to negotiate. You have to take in Russia as a partner in negotiations. And the only solution to the Ukrainian problem is, in fact, a joint Russian-Ukrainian solution. So therefore, there's no point in isolating Russia or trying to say, no, Russia doesn't play an important part here.
Okay, James, where do you stand on that? Because we still hear John Kerry every once in a while saying Russia has a few hours to do something, and Russia doesn't do it, and we don't see the isolation as he claims.
Yes, Kerry is highly embarrassing. I saw him the other day making a Vietnam disclaimer about the statistics in Vietnam, and here he is, in fact, lying about Snowden. I mean, I find Mr. Kerry almost as embarrassing as Biden, actually, in the situation. But America, I don't think, is trying to isolate Russia. I think there's a lot of vestiges of Cold War containment and protecting the borders. But I think more sinister than that, I think America is trying to present Russia as isolating itself. And I think that's really, really worth examining. There's misinterpretation of Mr. Putin's moves in this, and I completely agree with Martin. He's been actually from the beginning totally in charge, and now he's even more so as a result of scandals in Poland. I think the Americans really aren't a part of this picture any longer. This is being done between Germany and France, and above all behind invisible oil vestiges and interests that are extremely concerned to keep everything open here. I think Poroshenko has found himself in a very awkward position. He's gone to the West and asked them to make him a member, and they've made it pretty clear not going to do it. So suddenly he realizes that maybe the deal Russia offered him with Yanukovych was better than he thought. And so now he's got really serious financial problems. Crimea's got its oil around the coast there off the water, and we've got the steel industry at the other end. So suddenly he's got to make sure he gets that back. And I really feel quite horrified by the things Hillary Clinton's been saying. I think she's unfit for office after talking about vaporizing the Iranians and Putin being Hitler. This situation reminds me, because of the financial balances here, most of all of the Nazi preoccupation with oil in Baku. I don't think Poroshenko's government is going to last very long if they don't get some serious financial support in the range of $200 billion, and they're not going to get that from the West. So suddenly he's faced with the prospect that if he remains in power, he's got to make absolutely sure he gets a hold of the East. And he's taking the most extreme line. I mean, I've been over the Goebbels papers and everything, and I've never heard that kind of language used on anybody. Parasites, dirt, terrorists. This is his own people. And Human Rights Watch came out with a report.
Yeah, but you should think, James, that's the problem. I agree with you. Poroshenko has the wrong partner, and it's the United States, because U.S. policy is made in air-conditioned offices and think tanks, and it's not based on reality of what's going on the ground here. Let me go to Andrew here. James brings up some really good points. There's individuals that have been sanctioned. But when it comes to important sectors like the oil sector, I think, Madam Merkel gets a few calls from the energy sector in Germany. The Americans are here in a very big way, and deals are still being made here. It's rhetorical, most of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's mostly rhetorical, and it's morphed into a type of slogan. It's really good for American politicians with election campaign coming up. Of course, we have the midterms, and eventually, as was mentioned, there's going to be 2016 presidential elections. And ironically, it seems to me that while the West, or in this case the United States and some individuals, are talking about isolating Russia, this kind of isolates these individuals from the Russian market itself, which, it's one of the largest in the world. Russia is one of the largest economies, and it was already mentioned that Russia will have to be needed to help bring some type of peace and stability to Ukraine, but not just Ukraine. Russia is also necessary for Syria and Iran. This makes Russia a huge Middle Eastern diplomatic power, if you will. Russia's going to be...
we have Russian planes arriving in Baghdad, don't we?
Yes, they've already arrived, and actually that's one of the reasons that some people may say that ISIL hasn't been advancing because air power was is the game changer, if you will. And then you also have a Russian role that's going to be played through the CSTO with the Afghan withdrawal in 2004 later on at the end of the year. And also what a lot of people forget about is Russia's involved with North Korean nuclear talks. So Russia's all across the board diplomatically, and it's impossible to isolate something like this.
Charlie, you're a businessman here. You're involved in investments here. Let's look at before the crisis and now, and think of the term isolating Russia. Where does it? How does it fall?
Well, it's pretty clear to us that in no way has any isolation occurred yet. I agree totally with Andrew that it's very much a slogan in the West that seems to be needed for some kind of domestic consumption there. Martin is actually absolutely right. Russia is way too big to isolate. I mean, if you think about sanctions, and you think about the history of sanctions and how the West has tried to sanction different countries over the past years, they've done it to Iran, they've done it to Cuba, they've done it to North Korea,
Iraq,
with great difficulty, and all of those countries are much more isolated, further away from Europe, have fewer contiguous borders with big trading partners. I mean, Russia has a contiguous border with China. They border
a big gas deal also.
They border with Japan, the second biggest economy in the world. They're one of the biggest trading partners of Germany. I mean, there's no way you're going to isolate this country. And when the Western politicians, especially American politicians, talk about this, you kind of have to think, are these people even competent? Do they know what they're talking about?
Well, one of the things, we'll go back to the midterm elections. I think Andrew's really onto something here, but I want to still broaden it out here. Martin, there are some people in Russia, and I'm talking about the Russian political elite, when they hear the word isolation from the West, they applaud. They want that. There are people who've been saying to Putin and to Medvedev that, why do you want to get in bed with these people? Why? We have a different value system. We are always lectured. I'll give a concrete example. We have factories, military factories in eastern Ukraine that are of Soviet vintage. I want to stress Soviet vintage. Well, as things continue to sour in Ukraine, Russia's going to have to build its own new modern factories here. And this is something that isolation has the other side to it, because it makes Russia, and I had it on the program last week, we talked about the economy. This is actually an economic driver that can be used to Russia's advantage. Go ahead, Martin.
You're absolutely right. You can't isolate Russia, but you must remember also that there are military factories in Ukraine, which the Russians rely on for their military equipment. The other thing about America and the sanctions, the Americans have the capacity to isolate the international banks from doing Russian business with Russia. They're going to hit the Germans for sanction busting. They've hit the French and so on. So that can be done. They also, in high technology, in space research and satellites and things like that. And the high tech for the military, some of the things are in fact American. So therefore, the Americans have an interest, the American industrial, if you like, the military industrial complex, they've got an interest in doing business with Russia because they want to expand their market, and Russia is potentially a very important market. So the Russians themselves, if you look at the economy, the Russian economy at present is running into recession, and what is needed is a lot of new investment. Crimea may in fact cost $8 billion. And eastern Ukraine, President Putin seems to have decided that eastern Ukraine is too difficult. It's not worth getting involved there because of the expense and also the international problems it would.
I think one of the things that isn't voiced very much here, and it's my strong opinion, is that it was the West that went in and changed the status quo in Ukraine, a forced coup. The country is in a spiral, and we all know that. But the interesting thing is that Russia isn't obligated to fix Ukraine. It's been broken by someone else. James, we've been mentioning the banking sector in Europe and America, and one of the theories being thrown out right now is that Russia is trying to divide the Americans from the Europeans because they have very, very different business interests. Do you buy into that?
Well, I think America's strategic position in these discussions. I mean, I understand what you're saying, Martin, about the finances, and it could get worse. But I think that Germany and France are controlling the issue here, and I don't actually think that. I mean, we've gotten past the point of splitting America from Europe, because I think Sikorsky and his crowd in Warsaw have been pretty well silenced in this, and that was where an awful lot of the cheerleading was coming from. I mean, we're in a very different situation in the last interviews I was in here. It's much quieter. It's between Ukraine and Russia and the oil companies in Europe. So I don't think that's even an issue any longer. I do think that Putin. Last night I was at a reading of a spectacular new translation of The Bronze Horse, and Putin talks a lot about Peter the Great, and I was interested in the line in this poem, which I had never had real access to before, about hewing a window to the west. I mean, Putin is in some difficulty here in following a very Peter the Great line, because Peter was also quite contemptuous and wanted to denigrate his neighbors, the Poles in particular, and he's had to pay a hell of a price for that. Russia has over centuries. So we have here a young generation of Ukrainians who've got rather bad government, and I think that the way that Putin deals with this situation, and make no mistake, this is war. If he makes the wrong decisions at this point, we're going to be in an exceptionally serious situation that he may even lose control of. So I hope that he's thinking that this appearance of Sovietization, and I would say it's an appearance. I was a Cold War warrior. I saw the Soviet Union. This is an appearance. But it is, in a way, following the Peter the Great line. I think something has to be done about this appearance. I think it's a public relations problem, because this has come up again. And all the Cold War warriors, the mothball fleet, as I call them, have come out of the woodwork to make a huge amount of propaganda about Cold War being revived and whatever. That's not what's happening at all. I think what's happening is more or less what Sikorsky said was happening when he was being eavesdropped on. Forgive my putting it this way, but he claimed that he did a lot of sexual favors for Americans and they did nothing. They were feckless and ignorant. So, I mean, I think that's more or less right. And I think Obama is, in a sense, Putin's best friend in this. I don't want to hear Obama criticized, if you don't mind. I think he's your best friend. I think he's Russia's best friend. He and Putin have a great deal in common, as I've said several times already. So I don't think America is really...
But James, he has the worst foreign policy team imaginable at this time. It's extraordinary. His weakness is not that he's a weak president, and it's not that he's indecisive. It's just he chose the wrong people around him. This is the real problem here.
Well, his foreign policy team, can I just butt in there, were for many years, 8 years, were lobbyists in Washington. So when Clinton took over, these were not very professional politicians, and we're still living with that now in the Democratic Party.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Andrew, I read this morning on the way to this recording 3 different articles in Western media, supposedly highbrow, about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Can you tell me the date of that, when that happened?
Well, it hasn't happened.
That's my point here. And I'm just echoing and agreeing very much with James here, because this is what has happened here. All right, let's go back to sanctions and isolation.
Can I jump in for a second?
Go ahead.
Something Martin said. Martin was saying that the U.S. does have the capacity to sanction Russian banks the way they've been doing it with European banks. But, that's actually not going very well, the whole European bank sanction thing, because... and it's because the U.S. looks incredibly hypocritical when their major banks over the last 10 years have pulled off basically what are just huge crimes that people are writing about. People like Matt Taibbi, for example, at Rolling Stone, has come back at this again and again and again, saying, look, how is it possible that we haven't prosecuted anybody? How is it possible some of these people haven't gone to jail? How is it possible these banks haven't paid massive, massive fines? In fact, we've given them money to keep them alive.
I have the answer. Putin did it. It's Putin's fault.
So now the Europeans are saying, wait a minute, and you're fining our banks? Excuse me, are you saying here? And it's the same thing. I mean, the whole financial sanction thing isn't going to work.
Andrew, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, what I think is interesting is just in general, when I'm looking at this whole mix of things, I think in the past it seemed as though the West had this initiative. I mean, they're the ones that are trying to implant sanctions. They're trying to give Russia a black eye. They're trying to isolate Russia in the world community, so to speak. But what's interesting is Russia itself has almost acquired a new type of significance and impact as a result of this crisis. I mean, when you look before this, Russia stood up to the United States in Syria, stopped a war. This is one of the first times the U.S. has actually backed down. Lavrov and Putin gave Obama a diplomatic retreat. It happened. Then one can almost say that Russia snubbed the U.S. after the Crimean unification. So in a way, what you're seeing is Russia was resisting this Washington political consensus of unipolarity and sending a message all across the world of state sovereignty. And this resonates with many. This type of alternative, there hasn't been such a type of alternative message since the end of the Cold War.
I think that's exactly what Obama probably intends. I mean, he's got an establishment around him that appears to be strong. I think he would rather take non-intervention, have it interpreted as hypocrisy, frankly. I mean, I think that they've been very happy to go along with Lavrov in these situations. I think it was understood that if they got into Syria, Israel would become involved, and you'd have World War III. It was one of the most scary moments, at least in my life. I don't actually think that, I think Putin has scored exactly what he wanted to do in this. He's been Peter the Great. He's come forward. China and Russia are coming into the world together, and Russia has interests all over the planet. I mean, for example, in Paraguay, the entire beef industry is shipped to Russia, and I think they ought to be keeping a better look on that because a lot of tribes are being wiped out by the cattle people down there. I mean, the Chinese are everywhere. They've been rather careless about their investments, but they don't export military. And I think Obama understands. He's dealing very closely with Xi, and I think he's letting Putin come forward. I mean, I think he's allowed it to happen. I don't think this is something that has been uncollaborative. I mean, I agree with the foreign policy establishment, but when were they ever able to do anything? I mean, they've been a catastrophe since the Korean War.
Okay, I can agree with that. Martin, going back to the U.S. foreign policy establishment and Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin as a person that gets kicked around a lot in Western media. Martin, it seems to me, and Syria has been mentioned here, and I think that's important, people like Victoria Nuland, she doesn't want Russia and Putin to help out in Syria or help out in Iran or any other place. This is the problem because Russia wants to and can be an effective player.
The United States sees Russia as siding with the other side. They see Putin as somebody who's basically anti-American. If the Americans want something, Putin doesn't want it. If the Americans are against something, then Putin's for it. So I think they have this view of Putin, that he's basically anti-American, and this is emotional rather than intellectual. And to go back to Peter the Great was a great Westerner. You should point that out, that Russia had to learn from the outside world and so on. And Putin, at present, is saying that there is a Russian world, and the Russian state should protect that Russian world against the encroachments of the outside world, against the encroachment of the United States and elsewhere. The thing about the Middle East is that Russia is involved in Syria, has always been involved. The Soviet Union was there from the 1950s onwards, so they have an interest there. And Russia is now basically on the same side as the Americans in Iraq, trying to fight ISIS. So it's quite extraordinary that one day President Assad is your enemy, and the next day he's your friend because he's against ISIS. So the situation is changing all the time, and Russia has the ability here to go and start selling arms.
Yeah, but Martin, the U.S. doesn't want Russia to help out. That's the whole point here, because one could make the claim that what's going on in Ukraine right now is payback for what happened with Syria. What do you think about that?
I think that from the American point of view, it would be very nice if Ukraine were part of the Western region, if you like, and that NATO and the American military could be there because they see Iran as a great evil and so on. So they thought that Ukraine could be detached from Russia. And they didn't quite realize that from Russia's point of view, Ukraine is not a foreign country. It's, if you like, a brother. It's part of the family and so on. And you can't really detach Ukraine from Russia. And the Americans haven't quite realized that. And they think that you can then develop Ukraine as America has developed. And fortunately now Obama, as a president, is a person concerned with domestic policy. Not really. He must wake up in the morning and when he receives the policy briefs and so on and say, "Oh no, not more foreign policy, please. Let's concentrate on the domestic."
I wonder if he watches Jen Psaki's 5 o'clock follies here. Yeah. Let's change gears a little bit here, Charlie. Another issue is here, and I think this is something that's so misunderstood and overlooked, is that Putin is under pressure at home as well, because this is a very emotional issue. Ukraine for so many Russians because there's so many family members. I mean, and this is something that I think it's part of the American calculus. I think this is an awful plan coming out of Washington. I don't see any good thing coming from it. But this certainly is an element here because, in a sense, it's a civilizational choice here because this is for a lot of Russian speakers in East Ukraine, and then on the other side, on the other side of in Russia, there is a legal border there, but it's not a border in a personal sense.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely amazing what's happening here in terms of sort of a public consciousness. Because, I mean, for the last 2 or 3 months, the Russian airwaves and TV shows and news shows have been full of these reports of human rights violations, civilians getting blown up out of their homes by aircraft. Pictures of dead children, pictures of maimed people, people who've been civilians. These are women, children, young people, students, all those kids who were roasted alive in that trade building in Odessa. And then they see all these pictures of these, honest to goodness, real, neo-Nazis who are totally unrepentant. I mean, this is not a fringe group in Ukraine. This is a major group of people, and so you have a change happening I think in the Russian sort of personal consciousness. They're sort of turning into a country that they weren't perhaps 3 months ago or 4 months ago. There's sort of things that happen sometimes historically that it's a coming of age or sort of a change of mentality that can happen very rapidly. And I see this very much happening in Russia. And Russians are sort of realizing, hey, we're being attacked. And those are our people, our relatives, our friends who are being attacked. So you can't discount Russian public opinion, because Putin is not some sort of autocrat who's totally independent of these people. I mean, it filters up into every branch of the government, into the different power groups that are his constituency, and there are more and more people calling for action. And you see this on TV and on the internet, the Russian internet. You see these the nationalists and the right wing of the Russian political spectrum, really hitting Putin hard and saying you're a traitor.
Could I come in on this, Peter? Actually,
James, if I could just
can I just bring quick, NATO into this? Because
I'd like to stay with the human factor here. And I was speaking with Charlie a couple days ago. Is that I was on Study Audiobat on May 9th, and the overpouring patriotism that I saw, I was really, really taken aback, because we had the people wearing the St. George ribbon, and they were very, very proud. And Charlie, you've been in Russia a very long time, off and on, a good part of your life. I've been here for a long time, too. When I moved here, most Russians didn't have a high opinion of their own country, let's put it that way. It's been a titanic shift now with people with their identity and how they feel about their country. Go ahead, James, in London, jump in.
I think this is absolutely at the core of the difficulty and the extreme urgency of the next few weeks for Putin, because the huge gains he scored for the Russian people, which I've been in Voice of Russia radio applauding as much as I've been able to as an American, he can lose a lot of those gains. I mean, there are problems with supporting the agricultural, and I think one of our people is an expert on agricultural economy, so he could tell us what's going on in Crimea. He could lose there is a lot of instability inside Russia, and it's been shown during his election. Putin is vulnerable, and I think that the dynamic here involves a great deal the Ukraine wish to see NATO in Ukraine. I was down at Frontline Club a few weeks ago, and the Ukrainians there talking about polls about how many Ukrainians wanted to see NATO, and I said it's irresponsible to talk about this, but that's what they're talking about. There's something so savage about the way Poroshenko is going into those countries, into Donetsk, for example, approaching it, that it's as if he's trying to provoke an invasion from Putin. And I mean, the moment that there was any sign of that, then Rasmussen would come forward, and you get this cartel of let's get NATO into Ukraine. At all costs, this has to be avoided. And I mean, it's an extremely difficult call for Putin, actually, because it'll be extremely painful, even for people in the West, to see Russians brutalized in their own country by this government with all of its horrible rhetoric.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Martin McCauley, you wanted to jump in, please.
If you look at the rhetoric in the last week in the Russian press about Ukraine, it's been toned down. They hardly use the word junta or fascist to describe the regime in Kiev. And if you go back to the speech on the 1st of July by Putin to his ambassadors and others, it was in fact very, very mild when it came to Ukraine and so on. So I take those two references as meaning that he's drawing back and that he sees the risks that going into eastern Ukraine are far, far too great. And therefore, he's in a difficult position, as everyone has said. He has to tone down his rhetoric, and there's a very strong establishment in Russia which would like to get involved in eastern Ukraine and so on. Nationalism and nationalist euphoria is very, very great. And he, in fact, appears now to be trying to calm all this down. This is going to be very difficult for him because he's got to lose support.
Martin, my theory about this is, and I want to turn to Andrew about it, is that there's always these constituencies in both camps, if I can put it that way, that love to use the rhetoric of something must be done, something must be done. It seems to be the new foreign policy mantra for everyone, irrespective of what side you're on. But Andrew, it seems to me, thinking about what Martin just said here, Putin has the long-term plan here, because we I want to turn to Charlie about the economy in a second, but we have austerity being introduced in Ukraine. We have hostilities. We have instability. We've had political parties attacked, even to the point of being destroyed. We have Poroshenko that is looking to Washington for help. And I'd like to remind our listeners, Mr. Saakashvili in 2008, August 2008, appeared to have American backing, and we all know what he did, and we all know what he's doing right now. He can't even return to his own country.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think there is a long-term objective going on here because you have warfare in the conventional sense, and you have strategic warfare, which kind of circumvents soldiers and what people associate with the military. If we look at Ukraine, as you mentioned, with the economy near collapse, with all of these critical infrastructures basically just falling apart, I mean, the country is divided in many ways. You would see, as John Warden theorized, in his 5 rings, you see the organic essentials, if you will, of the Ukrainian state falling apart, which in turn can lead to the collapse of his leadership. And one other thing I'd like to mention real quick that I believe Martin talked about was this idea of the Russian world. And I think that's very, very important because Russia's foreign policy concept that came out in 2013 emphasized the role of civilizations and that there's different models in different worlds. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, as was mentioned, all these humanitarian atrocities being committed, this is kind of like a snare, a provocation, a temptation for Russia to intervene. And we just have to be reminded of Zbigniew Brzezinski, his Eurasian Balkans policy of Eurasian destabilization, basically, and the fact that he did create the Afghan-Soviet war. He has admitted towards trying to provoke the Soviet Union into a war from the summer of 1979. And with all these emotions surrounding Ukraine, this is confirmation in Russia and also across the world of the civilizational identity and the fact that civilizations can also be, in a way, actors and forms of identity for people.
Well, certainly creating more of a stronger identity here. I want to get back to some facts right here. Charlie, tell me what has happened to the Russian economy, the ruble, the stock markets, the whole shebang here, okay, since November of last year to the present.
Yeah, well, the important point to take away here is that in fact the stock market has gone up since the Ukraine crisis started, and the ruble has gone up a little bit too. And this is something that's very interesting because, if you follow the narrative in the Western media about the Ukraine crisis, that you always hear this line, since the Ukraine crisis, the ruble has crashed, the economy has gone into a tailspin.
Newland's testimony to Congress, yes.
I mean, it's and it's like an obligatory thing in every piece. I saw it in a Tom Friedman article recently, and I was like, where did this guy, didn't he do his homework, or didn't his fact checker do his work? Anyway, and this is part of the whole isolation argument that, see, it's working. We're going to drive this economy into the pit, and then they're going to have to do what we want them to do. And it's absolutely not happening.
It's like the Romans just declare victory and leave. Okay,
yeah,
that's what happens.
Yes, the ruble has gone down. It's gone down 20%, but it went down already starting in November, and by February it had already hit where it is now, and it's actually gone up since then.
Martin in London,
may I say something? The Russian economy this year may go into recession, and this may be a long-term trend because they're expecting something like $100 billion to leave Russia this year, and even more than that left last year. And FDI, foreign direct investment at present, is in fact slowing down. So,
well, Martin,
I would disagree with
I
that.
get on a daily basis from my good friends in the financial community here in Moscow a morning note from a number of investment banks, and the worst case scenario is 0.3% growth, but no one in Moscow here is talking about recession.
Deutsche Bank just came out with 1%. for
1%.
2014 growth, whereas in the United States, I think it's going to be minus 0.5% or something. So Russia is actually doing fine compared to the environment it's in. I mean, the economic area that it's in.
And I'd like to point out,
and
I'd like to point out to our listeners here that this started in August of last year. This was an intentional decision by the ministries and the government to stop stimulating the economy. Again, Andrew, what did you call this?
To drive down the ruble.
To drive down the ruble.
Yeah. If you look at it, it's to create a floating currency. I know that's one of the larger long-term goals of Russia is to have this currency that's a bit more flexible. And yeah, Peter, as you mentioned, I mean, these decisions were made back in August before anyone was even talking about a Ukrainian crisis, let alone Crimean unification, sanctions, and this whole scenario that we have now.
James, do you agree or disagree with my long-term plan here that the Kremlin may have here? Because what is happening in Ukraine has to play out. Because I don't see. I suppose maybe if there was just a massive ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, then a right to protect intervention would be justified. But anything short of that, there's not going to be an intervention.
I think if Putin were to go in, given the internal problems, it would not be categorizable as a humanitarian intervention in human rights terms. But in terms of the economic thing, there's a paradox here that's not being mentioned in terms of the word isolation, which is very important because it also bears on finances. America is got quite a strong economy, partly because everybody in the world considers it pretty well regulated. So people from all over the world, I mean, the Chinese, everybody want to invest in America. America, in its foreign policy, after these two wars, and in fact after Vietnam and Korea, is completely isolated. It's America that's isolated. I mean, we have our reputation. What this conversation seems to me to have been about is the reputation of Russia, the reputation of China, and the reputation of America. These three powers are going to have to get along. These are part of the strategic balances. We should be, as Blair, I think, rightly pointed out, we should be working together to deal with the caliphate, which has just proclaimed itself in a very, very visible way just a couple of days ago. And we must stop provoking. I mean, I gave to somebody here the other day this extraordinary fact that's come out that Brzezinski actually was threatening the Russians and the communist regime in Afghanistan, not after the Russian invasion, but before it. And when you think that the Bush was encouraging the Euphrates boat people to rise up, and then when they rose up, and they didn't come to their rescue. I think the Ukrainians should be very, very careful about expecting the Americans to intervene in any way. I don't think they're capable of doing it. I don't think they're prepared to do it, and I don't think they're going to do it. I don't think Merkel would let them do it. I mean, she's much closer and understands Putin much better than the Americans do, and I think they must understand this by now.
Martin, pieces of what James said there are just absolutely spot on in my opinion here. The Americans are not going to save Ukraine. The European Union isn't going to save Ukraine. I mean, the European Union and the United States, through different strategies, broke Ukraine in a very nasty, tragic way. But those two entities in Brussels and in Washington, they're not going to pay for Ukraine. They're not going to fix it. And what they want to do is they want the Russians to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if Obama had a choice, Ukraine wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be a problem that he wanted to entertain. So from his point of view, please don't bother me with Ukraine. But the IMF and World Bank would presumably provide some money and so on. The European Union has a much closer interest because if Ukraine becomes a failed state, it collapses and so on, you'll have a flood of refugees. And where will they go? They'll go westwards. They'll go into the European Union.
Well, they're not going to go to Texas, that's for sure.
No,
and that's my point here. That's my point here.
They're not going into America, but they will go into Eastern Europe and then into Western Europe and so on. So the European Union must keep Ukraine afloat. It must put in some money and help the government to function and so on, and hope that it will gradually grow from its present desperate state. And from Germany's point of view, they will try and integrate Russia as well because of German economic interests in Russia and so on. So Germany will in fact push Ukraine and Russia together, economically together if they can, and develop in that way. Because if you look at the European Union now, if you look at the people who are taking over from the present establishment, they are basically German. So therefore the European Union is Germany, and Germany will decide the policy towards Ukraine and Russia.
Peter, can I add? Can I answer your question?
Go ahead, James. Go ahead.
Can I add? Can we just do a phase two? I hope I've been often enough completely in support of the Russian people for months now to be able to say this, that I think Putin has a great opportunity at this point because he has got this popularity. He has, in a sense, pulled the Russian people together in the Peter the Great way, but he's also used some fairly draconian Peter the Great methods internally. And I think that a way of compensating for his, I think, powerlessness, if one isn't going to imagine something like Colombia with the FARC going on in eastern Ukraine, I think he doesn't really have an awful lot of ability to save eastern Ukraine. And one way he can deal with this is loosen up a bit on rights internally in Russia. I mean, I'm not want to make a big pitch about this, but I mean, there's been some Peter the Great deprivation of rights and whatever, and Putin could consecrate himself as a great world moral power, which I think Russia in many ways is, by loosening up a bit internally. I think that would be a kind of payback and a consecration of what he's achieved in this situation.
So you think Victoria Nuland would give Putin cookies for that?
I think Victoria Nuland is an idiot. I mean, I don't think she... Why are you quoting her at me? I mean, she's a cookie person. And she also says, F*** Europe. So, I mean, what kind of foreign office do we have? I mean, it's so embarrassing to be American at the moment.
Well, I just don't know why the West has to treat Russia like a child. Russia doesn't going around the world starting wars. I mean, on the issue of human rights, if you live here for a long time, you notice there's a pretty powerful fifth column here. And that's what they're worried about. I agree on some of the things that happen. Russia is certainly not a monolithic place, and there are people in power that make decisions and do things that sometimes I find appalling. All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. I want to thank my guests in London, Martin and James, and here in Moscow, Andrew and Charlie. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with Voice of Russia.